Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's Levitt Endowed Lecture. I'm Ira Muramoto. I'm the department chair for family medicine. And we're really grateful for those people who are not here in the room with us, but also coming and joining us virtually from online. So just a little bit about what is the Levitt Distinguished Speaker Series. It is a series based on an endowment from Dr. Louis P. Levitt, born in Denver in 1896 and graduated from CU School of Medicine in 1927. Practiced medicine in Denver for 40 years until 1967, and he passed away in 1978, leaving a gift of $75,000 to the Department of Family Medicine to sponsor these distinguished speaker lectures on topics that are important to primary care, family medicine, and then communities that we serve. And one lecture a year we dedicate to a memorial lecture in partnership with CSTAHR, Community and Students Together Against Healthcare Racism. And the students and their community partners select speakers that they would like to hear from. So we want to be sure that people are up to date on what are the current issues and trends that are going on that impact our practice, our communities. And one of the things we've done the last few years is make this a hybrid event. And the goal was to reach a wider audience across the country. We may even gotten some people from outside the country to be aware of the good work that goes on here in University of Colorado, Department of Family Medicine. And I'm particularly pleased about partnering with CSTAHR to give them that recognition and let the rest of because we advertise this really broadly, to let the rest of the country know and maybe inspire students in other medical schools to start similar initiatives. So the event's going to be recorded in case you miss it, and then you can find these on our website. And now I want to turn the program over to CSTAHR leaders, Quinn Scallon and Farouz Kadain, to introduce our CSTAHR and our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for this year's Greg White Levitt Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Quinn, and this is Farouz, and we're representing CSTAHR, which stands for Community and Students Together Against Healthcare Racism. CSTAHR was founded back in 2010 by CU medical students that worked with a group of community members through 2040 Partners for Health. And over the years, we've organized health education events, screening programs, advocacy initiatives, all aimed at addressing and dismantling some of the structural inequities in healthcare. At CSTAHR, we stand for inclusion, mutual learning, and above all, justice. We believe medical education doesn't happen in isolation, but rather in partnership with the communities we aim to serve. One of those partners was Greg White, a founding member of CSTAHR and the namesake for this lecture series. Greg was a tireless advocate for health equity at CU Anschutz and a true champion of the community voice in healthcare. To honor his legacy, we'd like to begin with a short video highlighting his life and the lasting impact that he's made.
Greg White.
He was a complex person with lots of layers.
So I think I would describe Greg as someone who was just incredibly committed, really dedicated to working towards health equity and using his own experiences to help inform how we can create a more just healthcare system.
Greg was a very unique kind of guy to me.
Some of the adjectives that I would use to describe him: passionate, unapologetic, He was just overall just this wonderful, genuine human being that I think had a really difficult life, and in my mind found a way to heal through CSTAHR. Hi, I'm Erica Martinez. I am currently a third-year resident at Stanford University.
Hi, I am Bella Mohapatra. I'm a family physician that works at Clinica Family Health.
Hi, my name is Mackenzie Garcia. I'm a fourth-year medical student in the MD and PH program at CU.
Hello, my name's Michelle Wheeler, and I'm a founding member of CSTAHR.
I think that CSTAHR really meant a lot to him because it was one of his ways of using all of his experiences with racism and the trauma associated with that to make our community better.
He helped create CSTAHR. He chose to invest in us and chose to teach us because he wanted to make healthcare better for people.
I think he valued most the relationships that he had with the students. He really thought that they were going to change the world in terms of, getting rid of racism in healthcare. He always kept us on track. He would always steer the conversation back to, so what are you going to do? And not just the individual. What are you going to do as a group? What is CSTAHR going to do as a group to end, racism in healthcare?
So this is a letter that I wrote to Greg. It was really just more of a personal reflection for me. I wrote it the night that he died. Dear Greg, I should have written this when I could have read it to you in person, but I missed that chance. So this is the best I can do. Actually, the best I can do is work throughout my life, like you did, to make the world a better place. I promise to listen to my patients with my whole heart, to consciously evaluate my own biases and the impact that my perceptions have on other people, and to work with others to create the world that you envisioned.
I know I'm going to be a better physician and a better surgeon for my patients because I met Greg. I think that his legacy was that each of us are going to carry a little bit of him to all of our patient encounters, to all of the projects that we're a part of. Speaking on behalf of all students and all current physicians, residents, everyone who has interacted with the CSTAHR community, I feel very confident in anyone who has known him that they are going to continue to work to fight against racism and discrimination in every way, shape, or form.
Thank you.
And now, it's my honor to introduce today's guest speaker, Associate Professor Negar Fani, a leading expert in neuroscience, clinical psychology, and innovative neuromodulation. Dr. Fani holds a primary academic appointment in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Emory University School of Medicine, and also serves as affiliate faculty in Emory's neuroscience and molecular and systems pharmacology graduate programs. Clinically, she has been a dedicated attending psychologist at the Emory Brain Health Center since 2013. Just last month, Dr. Fani took on a new leadership role as director of the Temporal Interference Neuromodulation Program, innovating ways to deliver precise neural stimulation non-invasively. In addition, she now serves as the Associate Vice Chair of Translational Research, a title that reflects her ongoing efforts to bridge the gap between laboratory innovations and clinical application. Her professional influence extends as a peer reviewer for top journals such as JAMA, Psychiatry, Biological Psychiatry, and PLOS ONE, and she serves on multiple NIH, DoD, and national scientific study panels. Notably, Dr. Fani is an outspoken leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion, co-chairing Emory's DEI committees, shaping anti-racist curricula, and mentoring numerous underrepresented trainees. Her research on racial trauma, brain health, and culturally tailored neuromodulation has been featured in JAMA, Psychiatry, NPR, CNN, and other prominent outlets. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fani, whose work challenges us to reimagine neuroscience and psychological care through the lens of equity and innovation.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you, Quinn and Farouz, for that really generous introduction. And I want to thank the Department of Family Medicine, in particular, Michelle, who I just met, the fiance of Greg White, who clearly has impacted the lives of so many. I have to say that I am the mentee of someone much like him, and I'm really hoping that I can help honor both of their legacies today in some of the work that I'm talking about. What I'll be talking to you all about today are some of the data that I've collected over the years and talking about my colleagues' data on neurophysiological signatures of marginalized stress, as well as novel neurostimulation approaches for stress relief. These are my disclosures, which are just honoraria I've received and don't influence any of my work currently. And just to share kind of the manifestations of marginalized stress that I'll be centering some of this work around. So I'll be talking about high effort coping strategies in the face of marginalized stress, focusing on hypervigilance or greater awareness of the environment, as well as rumination. And I'll also be talking about physiological shutting down or withdrawal responses in the face of this type of stress. I'll also, in the second half of this lecture, talk about stress relief strategies with a focus on a novel innovation that's come out of my lab. This is a closed loop respiration synced neurostimulation device. And just some caveats before I get into this, in that the kinds of brain and physiological signatures that I'll be talking to you about today are not signs of pathology. These are adaptations to chronic stress, and these are not deficits. So I just want to be clear about that. I also want to be clear that I'm here to talk about solutions for individuals because I'm a clinical psychologist and I want to help people feel better. The problem is not in individuals. The problem is in systems. And the work that you all are doing here and as part of CSTAHR is really designed to help with the system, and I really applaud you all for that. But a lot of the focus today is going to be on individual strategies for stress relief and how it can help collective communities. So what is marginalized stress? What do I mean by that? So for those of you who have experienced it, you know that it's not just one thing, it is many things. It is a type of stress that is experienced in the face of being treated inequitably, and it can be in an overt way or it can be covert. And it affects people regardless of their social status. And I'm going to bring up some examples from people who have pretty high social status. So this is a tweet that last year our former mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, who is actually running for governor in Atlanta, tweeted that she was again told by a hostess that she could not be seated in an Atlanta area restaurant because she had on quote unquote yoga pants, which was supposedly against their strictly enforced business casual policy. After I pointed out that there were patrons, none of whom looked like me, who had on shorts, baseball caps, and flip-flops in the restaurant, the manager offered to seat us in the not-so-full restaurant in an hour. It can't just be me. I did not eat there, and I'm hoping to connect with the owner soon. So this is someone with high social status who went to a restaurant in Atlanta, looked around at the environment, saw people wearing similar clothing, and saw that she was being treated differently than others, and it was being treated like nothing. And this was clearly something that was really deeply upsetting to her, but she didn't cause a stink. She decided to not do this, leave, go elsewhere. But this is something that affected her enough that she tweeted about it. Another tweet by another famous person, George Takei, talks about a different, maybe more overt type of marginalized stressor. One thing that many minorities hear more than a few times in their lives is, go back to where you came from. I always responded, what, Los Angeles? So this is actually something I've experienced myself, but just to give you some examples of how this type of stressor can manifest in the lives of individuals, regardless of social status. And this type of experience, many people have described as microaggressions. Scholar Ibram Kendi has described it differently and says that He does not use the term microaggression anymore. A persistent daily low hum of racist abuse is not minor. Abuse accurately describes the action and its effects on people: distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety, pain, fatigue, and suicide. So these kinds of situations that might be considered slight by other people are registering in the body, in the brain. And this type of stressor is what I'm going to be talking to you all about today. In terms of how frequently people experience these types of marginalization, so this is data from the National Center for Health Statistics that asked people of different races and ethnicities about experiences of discrimination, whether it be in a restaurant or a store, being treated with hostility, being criticized for speaking a different language. You can see that Hispanic, Black, Asian, and American Indian, Alaska Native individuals overall report having experienced these types of things in their day-to-day lives at least a few times in the past year, with Black, Hispanic, and Native individuals reporting it the most. And these types of experiences register at an early stage in development. So these are data that just came out from the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, looking at children between the ages of 9 and 14. And so this is just about how frequently different children from different racial and ethnic groups report experiences of discrimination and trajectories over time. And what you can see is that overall, number one, Black children report it the highest across these different across these different years, but that there's an increase generally in children of color reported across the years, and children of immigrant backgrounds seem to report more of these experiences, particularly Hispanics. So clearly there is an inequitable treatment that starts early, that registers early, and clearly has an impact on people's lives. Inequities are experienced not just interpersonally, but in resources and inadequate resources. So what you're looking at here is the County Health Rankings data set. This is a map that shows you sort of percentages of where Black versus white child poverty, Black versus other types of child poverty is. And so you won't be able to see the details in this graph. What it's important for you to know is that orange represents areas in which Black child poverty exceeds other types of child poverty. You can see that this map is populated mostly in orange, and the areas that have the largest circles have the greatest proportion of disparity. So clearly there are differences in resource availability for different racial and ethnic groups. And this has a differential impact on the brain. So these are data that came out in 2023. This is my colleague, Dr. Nathaniel Harnett, who has led this study on the same adolescent brain and cognitive development study. And he's looked at how different racial and ethnic groups had different patterns of brain activation and brain volume. And what he found with the ABCD group comparing Black to white children is that overall, white children had higher volumes in the brain, particularly in prefrontal and temporal regions, so areas of the brain that are involved with emotion regulation more generally. But when you account for inequities like resources, monthly household income, things like that, the differences between those volumes is either gone or almost eliminated. So resources play a big role in brain development, and this is not proportionally distributed among different racial and ethnic groups. These are things that have a clear impact on the brain. So this is showing you some developmental data, and my work has been primarily with adults and trying to understand how these different disparities and how people are treated differently can persist and have effects on the brain functionally and structurally. And I want to tell you a little bit about the context of my work, so why I even became interested in health equities. So I sort of grew up my research program in the Grady Trauma Project. So this is a study that started nearly 20 years ago and is the longest running study of trauma in the nation. So two investigators, Carrie Ressler and Beck Bradley, a psychiatrist and psychologist, were interested in what factors influence risk for post-traumatic stress disorder development in a primarily marginalized community. Grady Memorial Hospital is a publicly funded hospital in downtown Atlanta. And so they were, as a resident and as a postdoctoral fellow in psychology, interested in seeing why was there high proportions of people in the hospital that were reporting high levels of trauma, and there's higher risk for post-traumatic stress. So the way that they designed this study was recruiting people from primary care clinics and not from a psychiatric population more generally. So if you're waiting in the waiting area, which was for a long time, people were randomly recruited to be part of this study. The majority of people in this Grady Trauma Project, which started as one study but is now an amalgam of many studies, majority of people are Black, predominantly women, so a lot of the data that I'll be showing you today are on Black women. Majority adults, and we have data on over 13,000 people to date. Something that's important to know is that people were living in resource-deprived environments, predominantly, so monthly household income. Over 55% of our population reported having a monthly household income of $1,000 or less. And when you look at the types of trauma that people report, so by and large, people in Grady Trauma Project experience physical assault with or without a weapon at some point in their lives. Other types of trauma are also pretty prevalent, but interpersonal trauma is quite high. The rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder are also higher than the national estimates. So in gold, you see this is the current estimates of PTSD and lifetime in blue. You can see that nearly half of our population meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder at some point in their life, according to our clinical assessments. Major depressive disorder, pretty similar. So this just goes to show how much stress and deprivation is experienced by many people in the Atlanta inner city community. And these are the people coming through our studies. One of the questions that I've had is not only these types of trauma, how frequently people experience it, but racial discrimination types of trauma. How often do people experience this type of discrimination where they might be treated differently in a medical setting or when they're shopping or trying to get a loan? How frequency of racial discrimination experiences affects the brain and behavior? So I've been really interested as a PTSD researcher in responses to threat-relevant stimuli. So I took data from the Grady Trauma Project where we're asking people about all different types of trauma experiences inclusive of racial discrimination. So this is a questionnaire that we give that asks about how frequently you experience it, in a store, in a retail, in a medical setting, et cetera. We looked at frequency of experiences and related to brain responses as people are doing a task that requires emotion regulation. So this is an affective Stroop task that you're seeing here. So the goal of this task is to respond to the number of numbers that are on the screen. So it's a cognitive task, and it has some attentional demands. And as they're doing this cognitive task, they see distractor images that we adapted this task to include trauma-relevant images. So trauma-relevant images for our population, like experiencing gun violence. So these are some of the distractor threat images that we're looking at responses to. And what I wanted to see was when we co-vary things like other types of trauma exposure or other types of psychopathology, what do we see with a signal with discrimination? This is what we found. So when we look at the frequency of discrimination experiences and regress it on brain activation to threat, we can see that the visual cortex lights up in people who've had more frequent discrimination. So the visual cortex is a part of the brain that's essentially involved with heightened sensitivity to environmental cues. So these data sort of line up with other growing studies of racial discrimination that show the visual cortex is more active in people who have experienced more frequent racial discrimination. There's also some similarities to post-traumatic stress disorder research. So visual circuitry has been highlighted in more recent studies of post-traumatic stress, particularly phenomena of post-traumatic stress that relate to re-experiencing and hypervigilance. So there may be some similarities of discrimination-related neurophysiological signatures with PTSD in this sense. And so what do we think about in terms of racist experiences that might increase vigilance? So racial trauma scholars have talked about how experiencing discrimination affects coping, both anticipatory coping, in the moment coping, and after the moment coping. So experiencing different types of discrimination can make you anticipate more similar type events in the future. So you may be sensitive to cues of the environment that might signal that someone might be about to enact some sort of racist event. So that might be part of it, and you may shape your own appearance to try and avoid that kind of situation. So greater vigilance, greater activation in these visual circuits is part of high effort coping. So it's a way of having to sort of change the way that you function to meet the demands and sort of survive or thrive in a given circumstance. And there are other studies that are showing a similar pattern of activation sort of listed here. Another finding that came out of the study is that people who had more frequent discrimination showed greater activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is an important part of the brain that's involved with suppressing responses from the amygdala. The amygdala is our fear center. What we expect is that when we're in a safe situation, we don't need a lot of prefrontal engagement, so we sort of have a homeostasis. But in the face of racist threats, there may be a heightened engagement of this part of the brain that may be involved with suppressing emotional responses, not expressing fear, anger, or other types of emotions to get by. And behaviorally, experiences of discrimination may not have any visible effects. When we looked at the data from the task that was given in the scanner, people who had experienced more discrimination didn't do worse on the task. They actually did better. And the way that I think about this is that the brain is working twice as hard to manage the distress related to these threat images to get by. And so you may not see anything behaviorally when someone is experiencing a racist threat and engaging in high effort coping, but you can see a difference on the brain. So a lot of people ask me, so what are the brain signatures of discrimination across different races and ethnicities? We don't have a lot of data to date, and this is really a nascent area of research. But Arpana Church and her lab has really investigated experience of discrimination more broadly. So outside of racial discrimination, asking people about whether or not they've experienced discrimination across different racial and ethnic groups, and grouping them differently, sort of with a high versus low effort, with high versus low discrimination profiles. So here what you're looking at on the graph on the left, you can see that there's high discriminators versus low discriminators. Their patterns of brain connectivity across different networks differ. So this pattern of activation that you can see in this study that I just mentioned is kind of congruent with higher connectivity that Dr. Church found in the central executive network in her sample of Black individuals. So there may be some similarities, particularly with Black populations, in engaging the prefrontal cortex, engaging in high effort coping in the face of this racist stress. This pattern of connectivity was similar across other racial and ethnic groups. So Hispanic, Asian, and white individuals also engaged these prefrontal networks and had greater connectivity in those people who had high levels of discrimination. But another network that came out in response to more frequent discrimination across racial and ethnic groups is that network highlighted in blue here, which is the default mode network. So for many of you may or may not have heard about the default mode network. So this is the network that's engaged when our brain is humming along, when we're doing really nothing. We might be engaging in daydreaming, we may be engaging in ruminative thoughts, thinking about our days, thinking about our lives. It's about autobiographical processing. And so this default mode network seems to be more connected across people who've experienced, across different races and ethnicities, in people who've had more experiences of racial discrimination. So this may be another sort of facet of high effort coping, is that when you've had more experience of discrimination, there may be in the moment tactics that you may engage in to sort of deal with the fact that you have to suppress maybe your emotions in the moment. You may have to be dealing with some incongruence with what you feel and society around you. So there may be societal lack of acknowledgement that what happened was actually a racist event. And when this happens, you may be dealing with your own sort of self-invalidation, like, was this me? Did I cause this? So all of these processes that are involved with autobiographical sort of events, this is a type of high effort coping, this appraisal of the situation, trying to think it through, think about different processes that engages the default mode network. And I think that this is important to sort of note, in this type of coping requires a lot of energy. And I'll get to the effects of this high energy coping on brain structure in just a moment. I have a student in my lab who's interested in sort of the intersection between these executive networks and default mode network, and how brainstem regions that sort of innervate both the default mode network and salience networks, so networks that are involved with high vigilance and high arousal, how they intersect. So Aziz El-Bashir is a neuroscience PhD student in my lab who's been looking at how experiences of discrimination relate to connectivity in the brain, focusing on these deep brainstem regions, so the locus coeruleus in blue, the periaqueductal gray, and the superior colliculus. These are brain regions that are essential to the innate alarm system. And what he found was that people who have had more, and so one thing that's important to note about this study was that he was not only interested in connectivity, but how it related to accelerated biological aging. So one way to look at accelerated biological aging is through DNA methylation. So DNA methylation relates to methylation at particular DNA sites. In this way, we can sort of derive a metric of biological aging. When there's greater methylation at particular sites, it's an indicator of higher biological age. And so when we see higher values of DNA methylation, age acceleration clocks, like Horvath's clock, we can see that there is like sort of a greater epigenetic signature of aging. And one thing that he observed in this study was that people who have had more experience of discrimination showed a greater connectivity between the locus coeruleus, this is the main adrenergic center of the brain, and the precuneus, which is a primary component of the default mode network. He also found that this greater connectivity between the locus coeruleus and the precuneus was associated with greater DNA methylation age acceleration, and that this pattern of connectivity mediated the relationship between discrimination and age acceleration. So our way of thinking about this, so this is all resting state scan data, so we didn't know what was happening in the moment as people were being scanned. But one of our thoughts was that racial discrimination may be producing neuroplastic changes in the brain, particularly in default mode networks that are involved with autobiographical processing, involved with high effort coping. And these neuroplastic changes may be playing a role in the accelerated biological aging we see in a lot of Black populations. So we think about these data in concert with other data that's been collected. So Brooke McKenna was a graduate student at Grady Trauma Project and was similarly interested in accelerated aging in Black populations. And she was also interested in internalized emotion, how people reported how they dealt with their emotions, whether they expressed them or whether they suppressed them. And what Brooke found was that inclusive of racial discrimination, people who had higher lifetime stress exposure and engaged in more internalized anger, so when they suppressed their anger more, this mediated the relationship between stress exposure and epigenetic age acceleration. So when you think about all of these data together, it could be that the high effort coping of having to suppress your anger, not express it, because that could be, in a societal perspective, really damaging for a lot of people's relationships, for their progress in life. So this may be something that has an effect on biological health, including the brain. And so when we take these data and sort of merge it together with structural data, so we can see that people have had more frequent experiences of discrimination, even after we account for other factors like other trauma exposure, household monthly income, things like that. We see decrements in prefrontal structures, whether you look at white matter, which is at the top, or gray matter, which is at the bottom. The concentrated effects of discrimination seem to be in these prefrontal cortical regions and may be sort of a manifestation of prolonged engagement in high effort coping. And it may be that experiencing more types of marginalized stress affect these brain networks that are involved with managing emotions, maybe suppressing them to get by, but over time, this has an effect on the brain structure and biology and could be leading to vulnerabilities particularly with respect to age-related diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, as well as metabolic syndromes, cardiovascular disease. So this is creating sort of a brain health vulnerability. Another facet of marginalized stress that I think is important to talk to you all about today is the way that it can sort of disconnect you from the self, including the body. So this is a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who has described the experiences of body disconnection that are faced by many Black Americans. It is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. I think what W.E.B. Du Bois is describing here is the stress that's experienced from sort of having to separate the knowledge of oneself, the connection with a person's identity, with having to deal with the stress of having to view the self through the lens of another, the lens of someone who may be seeing the person as inferior or different. This can lead to a disconnection from the self when society treats you as inferior. And this, I think, is a way for us to think about syndromes of disconnection in marginalized populations, like dissociation, having to sort of disconnect from the self when the physical aspects of the self are seen as inferior or threatening in society. A lot of my work has sort of focused around connection with the self related to interoception. So interoception is a way of thinking about how we process our internal body signals. What I mean by that is we receive interoceptive signals all the time from our organs. So when you're feeling hot or cold, hungry or thirsty, these are all signals that are coming from within the body, interoceptive signals, and we use these signals to sort of regulate ourselves. If we ignore these signals, disconnect ourselves from them, then there might be an interoceptive blunting. And this is what we've seen in chronically stressed, chronically trauma-exposed populations, including marginalized populations, is that there is kind of an interoceptive disconnection in some groups of people who have experienced trauma. Trauma can also result in a different type of interoceptive disruption in that you may be misperceiving body signals as threatening. So you might experience a high heart rate and think, oh my gosh, I'm about to have a heart attack. And this is a different type of interoceptive dysregulation. So experiencing chronic marginalized stress can disrupt interoceptive systems in different ways. And so I've been interested in sort of understanding how discrimination affects interoceptive systems more broadly and can lead to manifestations, clinical manifestations like dissociation. And I have the same graduate student has sort of interrogated these questions, taking experience of discrimination and sort of tying them to connectivity with a particular hub of interoception, which is the insula. The insula is a central area of the brain, it's highlighted in red in both of these graphs, that's taking in information or signals from the body and sending it to other areas of the brain like the prefrontal cortex so that we can make sense of these signals and integrate them with emotions to do something to help regulate ourselves. With the same affective Stroop task, he found that people who have had more discrimination showed disconnectivity in an interoceptive network. So there was greater disconnectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and different aspects of, different disconnectivity between the insula and the medial prefrontal cortex. So these different components of the interoceptive network. And this disconnectivity was associated with dissociation. Depersonalization is a type of dissociative experience that people can sometimes have where they feel disconnected from their surroundings. And in our population of Black individuals, and this was all Black women who were part of this study, we found that this disconnectivity related to discrimination was associated with higher experiences of derealization. So, a lot of the data that I've shown you today is cross-sectional, and really, as we're scanning people, we're sort of wondering about what are the actual coping strategies that people engage in the face of marginalized stress. And we currently have an NIH-funded study that is helping us understand how daily experiences of discrimination logged through an app and measured through physiology, so people sort of wear a Fitbit device throughout a month, how we can take those data and merge it with neuroimaging data to derive brain signatures of not only discrimination, but coping styles. So we asked people not only about their experience of discrimination, but how they coped with that in the moment, whether they were suppressing it, reappraising it, feeling more hypervigilant, et cetera. We also have write-in responses, so we can see what is happening in the moment and bringing these data together. So there's a really wonderful group of people who are working with me on this study. Dr. William Smith is a racial trauma scholar. Robert Crafty is a statistician. You know about Dr. Harnett. Dr. Calhoun is a data fusion specialist. And Ashley Dennis Silas is a community consultant. This is a really essential part of this work. She works within a large behavioral health, mental health organization in Atlanta and helps bring our work to the public. And so in this study, we're trying to get a better sense of coping in the moment and how it's related to these brain signatures. So I've talked to you all a lot so far about these brain and physiological signatures of marginalized stress. I want to devote the rest of this time to stress relief strategies and closed loop neurostimulation. And I want to sort of center this around why focus on the body in general? Well, I've been bringing up interoceptive systems and their connection with the brain, right? There's also people who have come before me, more important people, who have talked about the body as a place for healing as well. So this is a quote from Dr. Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. He talks about the body, not the thinking brain, as a place where we experience most of our pain, pleasure, and joy, and where we process most of what happens to us. It's also where we do most of our healing, including our emotional and psychological healing. It is where we experience resilience and a sense of flow. And when we think about the research that's been done so far with marginalized communities, there has been a great focus on somatically oriented kinds of interventions. And there has been a lot of work on mindfulness-based approaches for healing in marginalized communities. And when we think about complementary and integrative health approaches, inclusive of mindfulness, there is a much greater desire for and utilization in marginalized communities. And for those of you who are part of the CSTAHR, this should come as no surprise that people who have experienced racism, including in healthcare settings, might be a lot more skeptical of or unwilling to engage in traditional Western practices, and complementary and integrative health approaches, which often focus on the body, can be really useful. Mindfulness-based approaches can be very effective in that they're not only bringing attention to the present moment, so mindfulness has different components. One component is just bringing present-centered awareness to the body. Another component of it is non-judgmental aspects. So it's not just about being present-centered, but it's about not judging your experiences, which is the opposite of the many times societal invalidation that people experience. So it's about experiencing anger, experiencing other types of emotions, and not judging the self, allowing yourself to have those experiences. So other people like Dr. Cheryl Woods-Giscombe have examined mindfulness strategies in Black communities and has sort of looked in both quantitative and qualitative ways about how acceptable these kinds of practices are in the communities. You can see a quote from one of the people in her studies that it can be something that helps people engage their attention effectively, and that isn't incongruous with maybe their own religious or spiritual practices, that it can be actually quite aligned. And so when we look at the neuroimaging data on mindfulness, we can see that it enacts its effects on the same networks, the interoceptive networks that I was talking about earlier. So the insula is something that lights up in people who are mindful meditators, as well as the prefrontal cortex. But for those of you who have engaged in any kind of mindfulness-based practices, you might understand that there might be some challenges with this. So there's a high rate of attrition with mindfulness-based practices, either through apps or through mindfulness-based protocols. So if anybody has been part of a mindfulness-based therapy protocol, like cognitive retraining, stress reduction, you know that it's pretty lengthy. Hours of meditation followed by a retreat. It's something that many people don't have the time or resources to engage in. It's a very effortful thing too. So if you've tried to sort of keep your focus on your breath for a long period of time, like me, you notice that your mind is going in all different kinds of places, and it's a really hard thing to do for most people. And especially if you're someone who is tuned out from their body, it's really hard to tell them to sort of focus on such a subtle interoceptive signal and keep it for a long period of time. So my goal has been to see how we can take something like mindfulness, which we know can be effective in the community and marginalized communities. How can we take it and hack this so that we can use systems that don't require sort of a top-down approach, but taking maybe a bottom-up approach to help people engage in mindfulness? This is what I've come up with. So I have a colleague over at Pittsburgh, Greg Siegel, who's kind of like a mad scientist and sort of puts things together in his garage. And we're thinking about ways in which we can take mindfulness and bring it to a different, more tactile kind of way. So we've come up with this device that's being modeled by our research assistant, Daniel, here, where every time Daniel breathes, it's detected by this respiration sensor that's on his abdomen. And he feels his breath, his exhale, as a vibration on the sternum delivered through this wearable subwoofer. So each time he breathes, he feels his breath as a vibration. And in this way, we're not taking the top-down approach. We're taking sort of sensory systems and hacking them so that people can feel their breath in a more visceral way and enhance their connection with their body in a way that doesn't require a lot of effort. So we have a study we call the MIND study, the Mechanistic Interventions and Neuroscience of Dissociation study, where we are really trying to see how this device may be able to access interoceptive and attention networks in people who have PTSD with highly dissociative symptoms, people who check out from their bodies. We randomize them to one of 4 conditions. So it's a vibration versus no vibration, breath focus versus no breath focus. We now have them do EEG as they're doing the interventions, but the interventions are brief. They're computer guided, 20 minutes long, 8 sessions. We are getting all sorts of data, including blood and cognitive data, to see if there are any changes pre and post intervention. We do 3-month and 6-month follow-up visits as well. During the 6-month follow-up visits, I meet with people individually, and I go through their data with them. That includes our clinical, imaging, and cognitive data. This is just some of the data that I showed a participant. This is just the past week. So when I showed them data on their physiology, so one thing I didn't mention is that we have EKGs and skin conductance as we're measuring during the intervention. This is someone who received the vibration augmented breath focus, and her skin conductance across the 8 sessions went down, her heart rate went down, respiration went down, heart rate variability went up. On clinical measures, her dissociation was cut in half. Her interoceptive abilities shot up. These are all things that we've found not only beneficial to gather these data, but to share the data with people and see if it maps onto their experience. I think that's been pretty powerful. Some other data that have just come out that are really compelling. I have a postdoc, Tim McDermott, who's actually from Colorado, who's wanted to look at different metrics of autonomic regulation, and he's interested in respiration. So he's looked at not only respiration rate, but respiration variability. So respiration variability references how variable your breaths are from breath to breath. And this matters if you're in the context of a intervention that's requiring you to breathe kind of in a rhythmic way. What he found was that in this publication that just came out, people who were getting the vibration augmented breath focus in red had lower respiration variability. This showed up pretty early, so within the 2nd session, we could see that, and it decreased over time. And diminished respiration variability corresponded with diminished negative emotionality over time. So as you were breathing more regularly, your negative emotions were going down. There seems to be some evidence that people were more engaged in this way. So it could be that this kind of closed-loop respiration guided feedback is helping people connect with their bodies, connect with the intervention more fully, and help them regulate their emotions. Another piece of data that just came out is some of our white matter data. So when we look at, so number one, we ask people from session to session about their experiences of connection with their body. People who received vibration augmented interventions, so this is irrespective of whether or not it was pulse vibration, respiration synced, there was greater body awareness over time in red as compared to the non-vibration conditions. And people who were getting the vibration also showed greater neuroplasticity in a white matter pathway that's essential to interoception. This is the corticospinal tract. So this is a tract that innervates various components of the interoceptive network and is essentially involved with sensory motor integration. So what you can see here is that vibration not only increased white matter integrity, there was greater neurite density in people who got the vibration, but this increased neurite density corresponded with lesser body dissociation. So these are some compelling evidence that shows maybe a neural basis for the changes that we're seeing with this intervention, which I think is really cool and hope to see this published soon. Furthermore, people are more engaged when they're getting the vibration. So these are our retention rates. On the left-hand side, you can see in red and in green, the vibration interventions have almost perfect engagement. So people are finishing the intervention because it is really something that keeps their focus on it. This is a quote from one of our participants, and our work was featured on this PBS show called Your Fantastic Mind. We have different testimonials of people's experiences, but she describes how whenever she's feeling anxious, a little rattled, she feels like she can feel the vibration on her chest and she can go with it. And that she's able to use the sensory trace to help herself regulate her emotions. So it's not just during the intervention that it's helping people, but there seems to be some lasting changes, which is really neat to see. So I'm at the end of this, and I really want to talk about what we've done in the context of the community. So with people like Ashley Dennis-Silas, our community consultant, we've been engaging in all different kinds of community events. We participate in resource outreach events where there's food and clothing giveaways. This is me in my lab where we show up to these events. We also give out resources about mindfulness practices in general. We have a brochure where we compiled a bunch of resources that are not just about mindfulness, but culturally adapted mindfulness strategies. And I want to sort of emphasize that the way in which we go about talking to people at these community events has really evolved over time. We've learned a lot about how best to discuss things like this with the community. And I think that it's important to understand the language with which you use to describe the interventions. Makes a world of difference between people sort of zoning out when you start talking to them versus getting engaged and wanting to learn more. We use terms like practice, relaxation, focus, exercise. These are terms that I think are a lot more accessible and relatable to folks who we've been talking about. So we talk also about the health benefits of mindfulness practices more generally. So not just talking about mental health, we don't talk about pathology, but we talk about stress relief, but we talk about things like heart health, metabolic health. And these are things that we actually are seeing data with mindfulness-based practices on. Another thing that people have noted is powerful is being able to see their own data. So this is important, is letting people see, and we do show them at the intervention sessions themselves, their own data. It sort of gives you a sense of control and agency, even in the context of this setting that clearly is under the control of medical professionals. Being able to see what your individual data is important. Finally, testimony is really essential. So we show clips of videos from that TV show that I mentioned earlier. We show testimony from other people to show that there are other people who they might be able to relate to or going through this and see this as valuable. So to sort of summarize, I think that there are many different consequences of marginalized stress. I've sort of shared with you different high-effort coping strategies and different shutting down or withdrawal responses that can occur. And I've also shared that somatically based intervention seems to be both acceptable and effective in marginalized communities. And this isn't limited to the mindfulness kinds of studies that I've talked about, but other types of mind-body strategies include neurofeedback and autonomic feedback. So heart rate variability Biofeedback is something that seems to be an up-and-coming kind of treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's notable that the attrition rates for these types of neurofeedback studies are quite low, and people report a lot of symptom reduction. So they seem to be rather effective. This is a study that just came out. This is on military veterans. And I think that being able to connect more with the self is a conduit for greater social connection. So feeling a greater sense of agency, control, and sort of self-validation will give you some more space to be able to connect with other people.